this point, so maybe I'll introduce you if that's all right. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this online talk. It's co-sponsored by NTU's History Program and our Environmental Humanities Research Cluster. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Dolly Jorgensen. She's a professor of history at the University of Stavanger, Norway, and presently co-editor-in-chief of the journal Environmental Humanities. She's also served as president for the European Society for Environmental History from 2013 through 2017. And she received her PhD from the University of Virginia, researching topics like environmental history, history of technology, and environmental humanities. And presently, her primary research interests are human-animal relations, the urban environment, and environmental policing. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dolly for this talk.
Thank you very much, Miles. I'm very happy to be here in this virtual space so that all of you can share with us as I present this talk, which I will now share, which I've called Dissecting the Heart, an Emotions History Approach to the Environmental History of Extinction. So the reason I've called this is a story that I want to start with. So the last known passenger pigeon, a female called Martha by her keepers at the Cincinnati Zoo in the US, died on September 1st, 1914. Martha's body was packed in ice and shipped to the National Museum in Washington, D.C., which is now known as the Smithsonian. Taxidermist William Palmer skinned her, and R.W. Shufeldt, who was a bird anatomy specialist, examined the body of this passenger pigeon before him. He documented in detail the work of the skinning and provided a thorough scientific description of her anatomy, taking numerous photographs along the way. And this is one of those photographs. From his investigation, so an autopsy, if you will, it appeared that Martha had suffered from severe internal bleeding. Her liver and intestines had disintegrated before she'd even made it there to the autopsy. He wrote up an article about this called Anatomical and Other Notes on the Passenger Pigeon Lately Living in the Cincinnati Zoological Gardens. This is a distant scientific description of the anatomical features of passenger pigeons. Yet he was moved by his work on this particular bird. So when he, in this very technical article, gets to the section in which he comes to the heart, so you're dissecting the different parts of the body, and he gets to the heart, he writes in this article, "There's every reason to believe that the internal anatomy of the auricles and ventricles of this heart of the passenger pigeon agree in all structural particulars with the corresponding ones in any large wild pigeon. I therefore do not further dissect the heart, preferring to preserve it in its entirety, perhaps somewhat influenced by sentimental reasons, as the heart of the last blue pigeon that the world will ever see. With the final throb of that heart, still another bird became extinct for all time, the last representative of countless millions and unnumbered generations of its kind, practically exterminated through man's agency." Now, this evocative passage is nestled within Shufeldt's otherwise very dry, ordinary scientific article documenting anatomy. And I think it provides a good entry point for starting to think through how emotions are bound up in extinction, bound up in the science of extinction, as well as the conservation actions that people take against it. And to think about how that has relevance for environmental historians. So our era of deep and substantial effects on the planet Earth and the biota on it, those effects brought about by human activities, have been characterized by many as a time of loss, a loss of biodiversity, a loss of habitats and fauna species. They're dominating discourses about our changing globe. The high number of species either recently extinct or facing imminent extinction, and the great speed at which that extinction is happening exceeds even the most well-studied extinction event, the dinosaur extinction that we all know of at the end of the Cretaceous. All indications are that the rate of animal extinction loss on Earth over the last few hundred years qualifies as a mass extinction event. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services issued a report in 2019 that involved hundreds of co-authors surveying the state of biodiversity worldwide. And what they determined was over 1 million species were currently threatened by extinction within this century under the status quo. So if we don't do anything different than what we've been doing, that's what would happen. Up to a third of all vertebrate species are thought to be globally threatened or endangered, and at least 322 vertebrates have become extinct since 1500. Now, with a situation like that, what's interesting is to think about the ways in which scientists have responded, because it has profound effects on scientists working in conservation, those that study ecosystems. So you have articles like Elizabeth Colbert's How to Write About a Vanishing World in the New Yorker, in which she talked to scientists who are working on coral reefs and the real grief that they express about seeing their object of study, the thing that they love, that motivates them, disappearing and dying before their eyes. The former editor of the major journal Restoration Ecology, Richard Hobbs, described scientists in conservation and in restoration ecology as living mostly in a world characterized by loss, and hence are either wittingly or unwittingly in a state of grief. And so there's a beginning to be a recognition by scientists that in fact they have emotional attachments to their objects of study, to the things in which they're trying to conserve, and that these are part of their base motivation for what they're doing. And I like this quote from John Mooallem, who has a book called Wild Ones, a sometimes dismaying, wildly reassuring story about looking at people looking at animals in America, in which he observes, in the 21st century, how species survive or go to die may have more to do with Barnum than Darwin. Emotion matters, imagination matters. The way we see a species can impact its standing on the planet more than anything covered in ecology textbooks. And I think this is a quote to consider then when we're thinking about environmental change and the way people study it or respond to it, that it's not just the science, but in fact, the emotion. So historians have been interested in emotions as a analytical framework to understand why people do the things they do. So as a historical discipline, the history of emotions is rather new. This recent turn to emotions as a phenomena to be explained and that offers explanations for why people do the things they do and have done. It has some roots in psychology as well as physiology. So thinking about both the way people think, but also the way their bodies react to particular situations, so physiologically. But it's been pushed into the realm of historical studies, notably, I think, by the work of Barbara Rosenwein, who's advocated the study of emotional communities, so how people create certain emotional responses as a group, so it's not just an individual thing, as well as Peter and Carol Stern's ideas of emotional standards within communities. And there's also scholarship that traces the historical development of particular emotions or the ways in which they're expressed. So like this famous work by Joanna Burke on fear and how that becomes expressed. So in general, scholars working in the history of emotions acknowledge that there are some common physical responses to particular events. So for example, increased heart rate if you're scared, or sweating if you're nervous. And then that seems to go across cultures. So it's a physiological thing with being a human. But there are other things which are very much culturally situated. So the outward expression of feelings that may be brought on through affect, so that physical thing is called affect, are socially constructed and socially interactive. So on a methodological level, getting at emotions in history is not easy. And yet what's interesting is that the history of emotions group has been very active within pre-modern studies. So medieval and early modern have been two of the main areas of scholarship. They've been doing a great deal of thinking about how to make the history of emotions into practice. And they do this by reading a large, wide variety of sources. So texts can range from letters to economic ledgers to dry monastic chronicles and objects, personal and public. So emotions are not just restricted, importantly, to overtly emotional texts, but they can be found in all kinds of documents about decision-making processes, about the reception, giving us insights into people's thinking and their emotional states. So in the historical study, unlike in sociological studies, informants can't be asked how they felt about something they did. Instead, those emotions have to be inferred from the traces that they left behind. Now, a history of emotions also recognizes that humans don't just feel one emotion at a time. There can in fact be many layers of emotions in the same trace. Within the environmental humanities, there's been a strong interest in thinking through emotions, particularly by those people working in eco-criticism. Film studies as well as literature studies have been the primary place in which this has happened, thinking about emotional responses to the moving image, thinking about the ways in which lyric poetry invokes certain emotional states from the reader, as well as what the writer was trying to do. History's been a bit slower. So environmental history within that has been slower in picking up emotions as a potential thing to consider. There's been work for a while on animal rights, although it's not been framed as a history of emotions. And this has to do with like campaigning against vivisection, for example. So like this drawing of showing frogs being used in nervous system experiments. So there's been work that situates those as emotional practices, although the historians have not necessarily thought of themselves as doing history of emotions. There's been some work on animal companions and companionship that is on this emotional side of things. Chris Pearson, for example, has an article on human-dog partnerships in the French army that talks about emotional bonds and attachments. A little on landscape change now. A good example of this is Daniel McFarlane's work on aesthetics of Niagara Falls and how the aesthetics you wanted to keep them for particular emotional reasons, right? So there's something about this sublime landscape that leads to a particular choices in the modification of the waterfall. And some about disasters. So there's a new article, for example, about floods and emotional responses to floods by Scott McKinnon and Margaret Cook. Michael Egan has an article about toxic fear and the unknown. So there's a little bit of work in environmental history, but it's really a new thing for environmental historians to start to think, how do emotions play in to the way people respond to their environment and the choices they make about it. So in my new book, which came out a year ago now, Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, I take up the issue of emotions when looking at how people respond to species being gone, and they try to bring them back. So these are all stories of bringing back species. So I look at how grief and guilt and hope factor into choices about what to do about these species. And so, this interest, I think, expands now as I think about extinction specifically, and how one responds to, or how people have historically responded to things becoming extinct and facing up to that as a reality. So what I wanted to do today then was to present some of the work that I've done that's kind of both in the chapter I have about passenger pigeons in the book, but also some additional things there that I've been thinking about. So the passenger pigeon that I started with, so this last passenger pigeon, Martha, who dies in 1914, is this species here. It was an extremely numerous bird in North America, probably the most numerous bird in North America at the time that white colonial settlers came to the continent. Encounters with the passenger pigeon in the 18th and 19th centuries stressed the sheer number of birds, the overwhelming abundance of those birds. In the first written description that's published, Mark Catesby's work on the birds of the southern states, he describes passenger pigeons as coming, quote, in incredible numbers, in so much that in some places where they roost, they often break down the limbs of oaks with their weight and leave their dung some inches thick under the trees they roost on. So they come in extremely large flocks, and you can see that in a drawing of hunters who would come to the places where the birds were migrating through, because they're migratory, moving between winter and summer feeding grounds. That the skies would darken. So James Audubon, the famous, and this is his drawing actually on the right hand side there. So Audubon described the passenger pigeon in 1831. He wrote that the multitudes of wild pigeons in our woods are astonishing. The air was literally filled with pigeons. The light of noonday was obscured as by an eclipse. The dung fell in spots, not unlike felting flakes of snow, and the continued buzz of wings had a tendency to lull my senses to repose. The pigeons were still passing in undiminished numbers and continued to do so for 3 days in succession. The numbers were immense beyond conception. So this was a bird that in no way was rare. It was extremely abundant, and it led to it being killed in very large numbers. Audubon had written about this. It was killed in immense numbers, although no apparent diminution ensues. he insisted. He thought that there might be problems with deforestation, so people cutting down the trees. But he said, persons unacquainted with these birds might naturally conclude that such dreadful havoc, i.e. the hunting here, would soon put an end to the species. But I've satisfied myself by long observation that nothing but the continual diminution of our forests can accomplish this decrease, as they not unfrequently quadruple their numbers yearly and always at least double it. So this was his position in 1831. There's nothing you can do about passenger pigeons. There's so many of them, these immense flocks. And this is what you see over and over again in the textual sources. But as I said, when you've got a big resource, you tend to have people who use it. So just to give you a sense of the numbers of pigeons that were shot, so in 3 years, shipped to New York and other eastern cities, about a little under 1 million dozen, so that would make it 12 million pigeons were sent in 3 years. So it became a regular commodity that was used by the urban poor. They were cheap, they would come in barrels, and were a ready meat source. So it was one of the greatest game animals on the continent. Yet, even after Audubon writing only in 1831, in 1914, the very last of the passenger pigeons dies in the Cincinnati Zoo. There's been a lot of debate as to why that happened, but obviously overhunting, as well as natural fluctuations in the population, kind of boom and bust cycles, which many animals go through, those things coinciding, as well as deforestation, clearances for making agricultural land as the white settlers continued to move into the Midwest, where these birds would go through. All of those things put together, potentially some bad years in terms of weather, the population disappeared rapidly. And people started to notice it was disappearing in the late 1800s. They started writing to each other like, have you seen the pigeons lately? They must be somewhere else. And it turns out that somewhere else was nowhere. They actually were dead. There were a few that were in captivity. They never reproduced well in captivity. So there were some attempts at breeding them. They didn't. Martha, who's the female here on the left, so, and this is something for those of you who visit museums to note, female animals are very rarely included in displays because they tend to be not as pretty and as colorful, particularly in birds, as the male. So you see the male. There's some interesting analysis of this that happens. So they tend to be shown in partnerships with males for visual purposes. So this is Martha, the last one. The other two are just males that the Smithsonian collected in the 1800s. So it was gone. It was extinct when this last individual died. So from billions to none pretty quickly. So my interest in this is not necessarily what happened to the pigeon itself, but what did people do when they realized this pigeon was extinct? How did they respond? How did they think about it and on an emotional level? And what reactions did they have? So what I want to talk about is 3 different individuals and the way they felt about the passenger pigeon, and to think through their emotions and their motivation. I think it's important then that the history of environmentalism, the history of conservation, of wildlife protection, and even of the scientific practice of biology more generally, is recognized as being bound up in the history of emotions. So I'll start here with William T. Hornaday and his mixed emotions. As I mentioned, emotions don't happen at one register or one level, that you have like one thing and you're only that thing, but instead it's a mix. So William T. Hornaday was the chief taxidermist at the National Museum, the Smithsonian, from 1882 is when it was renamed. So these sources would say National Museum often. He was then director of the Bronx Zoological Park, so the Bronx Zoo, for 30 years. And he became a key wildlife conservationist after having been a big game hunter. And so there's whole discussions about that. One of his major projects that he was involved in was the American Bison project. So in 1886, he had traveled to Montana to collect specimens of the American bison, so the things people sometimes call buffalo, so the American bison, for display at the National Museum. It was widely believed that they would become extinct, and so the museum wanted to collect them before they were no longer around. So one can have whole debates about this practice by museums. Is not uncommon in the times, in the 1800s, to want to collect something before it becomes extinct. Now, Hornaday was shocked to see that large herds that he had earlier encountered, because he'd been previously on hunts, had vanished, and that only a few animals survived. And so he became heavily involved in a saving project, in trying to save this species. One of the people who set up the American Bison Society. So the American bison actually does become extinct in the wild. It's only held in captivity. And so they started a breeding project spurred on by naturalists like Hornaday, as well as Teddy Roosevelt was heavily involved in this project. And they were able to actually save the species. So it begins breeding, and they're able to release it into ranges 1907 onto protected land. So Hornaday had a very strong attachment then, strong feelings about the bison and the issue of extinction. So in 1913, he published a book called Our Vanishing Wildlife, Its Extermination and Preservation. So in that book, this is the inside page, so the frontispiece. So not the cover, but the thing when you open the book, the first kind of page that you would see. So the frontispiece of it. And it faces the title page. So the title page is on your right, and this piece is on the left. The Folly of 1857 and the Lesson of 1912. So on the left side, then you get a quote from an 1857 report for the Senate of the state of Ohio that said the passenger pigeon needs no protection. So it's just like Audubon in this sense. It's not going anywhere. It doesn't need any protection, and no ordinary destruction can lessen them. On the right then is a picture of Martha. And the last living passenger pigeon, now 20 years old in 1912. So she dies in 1914. So she's not dead when he's publishing this, but it's the last one, and he knows it's the last one. And then it's interesting, at the top of the page, then you have this quote by Patrick Henry: "I know no way of judging of the future but by the past." So this idea of judgment shows up then throughout the book. And this judgment is a harsh and moral judgment. He chastises the American people writ large for their ruthless extermination of wildlife, including game birds and songbirds, big game and more. On the first page of his preface, he stresses that he's appalled, so he uses words like appalled at North America's wildlife slaughter, a restless, relentless desire to kill, he puts in italics with an exclamation point. There's a lot of passion and anger in his text, and you see it in the way he writes with these italics and with these exclamation points, more exclamation points than you would get away with, I think, in writing a text in most cases these days. He sets blame very clearly. It is a text that identifies violence and has violent language against that violence. So here you have a drawing, stop all or lose all, the remnants of wildlife. And here's all these things that have made holes, if you will, in wildlife that he talks about. And if you automatic and pump guns and the sale of guns and millinery slaughter, which is for feathers, is millinery. So this slaughter word shows up a lot in his text, in the way he describes what's been going on. So he's very angry, and there's if you read it, you really get the sense of a deep-seated anger at the situation. But what you also get is sorrow on top of that anger. So as an example, in here, he has a section where he's talking about whooping cranes, which were also and still also almost extinct. And he has a quote, "We will part from our stately Grus Americanus with profound sorrow, for on this continent we ne'er shall see his likes again." So it's this kind of this language of sorrow and mourning, while at the same time being very angry about the killing. So he's using in this text that kind of sorrowful mourning language, and you see it here in this figure that's in the section where he's talking about the extinct species. So you've got a tombstone, right? So they're sacred to the memory of these things then, but at the same time there's this punch of anger, right? Exterminated by civilized men. This blame on people for having done it, and he has, for example, he moves towards shame as a primary mode of emotional engagement. So he's angry and he's sorrowful, but what he does is he turns his audience and he says, "You should be ashamed at having done this." So he tries to shame them into action. So he says, we're weary of witnessing the greed, selfishness, and cruelty of civilized man towards wild creatures of the earth. We're sick of tales of slaughter and pictures of carnage. Extinction is injurious to the economy of the world, but it's a shame and a disgrace to the civilized portion of the human race. Now, we could get into an entire discussion of his idea of civilization and race, and that's an entire other discussion. But his point in writing is to shame his readers into feeling that they should feel so guilty for this happening that they would want to act, that they would need to do something about this situation because it's a disgrace. So he uses that language a lot of shame, ashamed, disgrace, disgraceful. So early on in the book, we see this. He says, "Man, the shameless destroyer of nature's gifts, blithely and persistently exterminates one species after another. So he praises, for example, the ladies of London for not buying hats with feathers and whole birds. So this was a big fashion in the late 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, was hats where you actually have a taxidermied bird that was on them. So he praises the ladies of London or he praises the ladies of New York for not doing what the ladies of London were doing. But he says there are still some stores in New York who sell these hats. He actually names them with their addresses as a shaming technique, right? He wants to get people to not shop there for other things, calling them shameless feather dealers. That the diminution of the global avian populations for feathers was a shame, a disgrace, and a worldwide loss. So this disgraceful and ungentlemanly nature of the activities. He wrote a poem in 1915, so it's not actually in this book, but in another text, where he takes on the voice of a son of a Western farmer, and the son asks, "But where are the birds, Daddy? Now, why do you look so far away? Your face is all red with what looks like shame." So this idea of that the farmer should be ashamed of having hunted these birds to extinction. So his texts, like this article, Wild Animal Extermination, Past, Present, and Future, you can see it, the emotional words that he uses. This is no time for cheerful optimism. It's a shocking thing to learn. Afterward, they will regret it, and it will be forever. So it's actually built into the way he thinks about extinction and how he thinks people should respond to extinction is emotion. But it's a really mixed bag of emotions. There's a lot of things going on, and to actually, yeah, it's difficult to untangle them. The anger from the shame, from the grief and sorrow, that he has all of those at the same time. So another example is Aldo Leopold. So here there were a couple monuments that were created for the extinct passenger pigeon in the immediate post-World War II period. So two memorials were dedicated in 1947. One in Pennsylvania by a group of Boy Scouts. The second was here at a state park in Wisconsin. And it was set up by the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology in 1947. And this monument became widely known because of the famous conservationist Aldo Leopold, who delivered a speech, which was then printed as part of the dedication booklet. And then it was later included in his son's county almanac. The speech on a monument to the pigeon. So Aldo Leopold was a conservationist, a forester, philosopher, educator, often touted as one of the earliest people to advocate ecosystem restoration. And it had one of his best known philosophical ideas was about the land ethic, which called for ethical, caring relationships between people and nature. So he writes this text, gives this speech about the passenger pigeon and memorials. And it's filled with this kind of funerary language. So I'll read just a little of it. So we meet here to commemorate the death of a species. This monument symbolizes our sorrow. We grieve because no living man will again see the onrushing phalanx of victorious birds, sweeping a path for spring across the March skies, chasing the defeated winter from all the woods and prairies of Wisconsin. Men who still live, who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live that in their youth were shaken by a living wind. But a few decades hence, only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last, only the hills will know. There will always be pigeons in books and in museums, but these are effigies and images dead to all hardships and delights. Book pigeons cannot dive out of a cloud to make the deer run for cover, nor clap their wings in thunderous applause of mass-laden woods. They know no urge of seasons, they feel no kiss of sun, no lash of wind and weather. They live forever by not living at all. This then is a monument to a bird we have lost and to a doubt we have gained. Tourists will read this inscription, but their thoughts, like the bronze pigeon, will have no wings. So in his speech, Leopold highlighted the grief he felt, and by extension, the grief we as hearers and readers of the text should feel for the extinction. Loss and grief were on his mind. So his grieving, though, was not on very specific pigeons, but on the species as a whole. The loss of a thing which, in his thinking about ecological restoration, should be part and parcel of the ecosystem. So this idea of or this emotional response of grief is very strong in a lot of the writings about passenger pigeons. So we see this, for example, in 1976, when the US government issued a pamphlet called A Passing in Cincinnati to commemorate the passenger pigeon's extinction. So like Leopold's text, the pamphlet is set up as a funerary commemoration of Martha. And you can see that in the graphic style, which makes each page of the entire text look like a gravestone of the time. The text announcing the death of Martha, so her obituary, is actually printed in the facing page to the one I have with her picture, that was run in the Cincinnati Enquirer, so the local newspaper. So it's very much like a little booklet that you would get if you went to a funerary service, so it's documenting the person's life. But in this case, it's documenting both the life of this pigeon and pigeons as a thing. So it's grieving at a graveside. So we can see the way then that this, how this emotion of grief factors into the way in which the passenger pigeon is talked about and presented in the literature. And my last example is on Ben Novak's Hope. So the Long Now Foundation was founded by Stuart Brand, who's best known for the Whole Earth catalog. So those of you that are in environmental history will recognize his name, which was aimed at supporting American counterculture and the nascent environmental movements of the late 1960s and 70s. So he established this foundation called Long Now in 1996 to instill long-term thinking in modern culture. So one of their most famous projects is the Clock of the Long Now, which is a clock designed to run for 10,000 years without intervention. And they have a project that was called the Long Bets Project, which takes bets on predictions that are no less than 2 years into the future. So it's about trying to get away from the very short-term political thinking that we have in our current culture to long-term thinking. So in February 2012, the Long Now Foundation gathered together a group of scientists and environmental thinkers and science writers at Harvard Medical School to explore the technical feasibility and pitfalls of using genetic engineering to resurrect the extinct passenger pigeon. The meeting then formalized in the foundation project of Revive and Restore, which as it says here, genetic rescue for endangered and extinct species. And it rapidly expanded in scope, so that it was not just about the passenger pigeon, but about many different species and how you could use new DNA technologies, particularly CRISPR technologies, which allow us to do kind of fine-tune editing of DNA to remake the passenger pigeon. So their project there is called the Great Passenger Pigeon Comeback, set up in a series of things in which you take existing related rock pigeon species, make modifications to the DNA, which then hopefully they pass on to their, to what's being born, gets those, and then they can pass them on to their children, so that eventually you take what's a rock pigeon now and you make it then into a passenger pigeon in DNA. And we can have whole discussions of that as a project and as an idea and concepts, and whether or not you're remaking something or making something new. But this is their passenger pigeon 2.0, as they call it. So new version of passenger pigeon. What I think is interesting is to think about one of the main people who's been involved in the project is a researcher by the name of Ben Novak. And when he's written about and thinking about why he's doing this, what you see is this real sense of emotional hope that the new passenger pigeon will refill the spot of the existing of the previous pigeon and bring about a better world. So this is a quote from a blog post that he wrote in the reflections of Martha's centennial. So I mentioned Martha died in 1914. So in 2014, there was a 100-year celebration or marking of her death. And so this is what he'd written as part of that blog. So the spirit of this new animal, right, will be as vibrant as Martha. But unlike Martha, this new bird story doesn't have to end in a cage. With a generation behind it, these new birds can grace the forests again and enrich the dancing cycles of the trees. They will enrich our souls if we open our hearts to them. The renaissance of their newfound proliferation will change the world the way Martha has already. And so in his reflections and in his text, we see that kind of hope and feeling that the world will be a better place through this very scientific work that they're doing. I mean, they're doing gene splicing, and they've already had some chimeras born, so things that have some of this new gene in it, and they're trying to build up a breeding stock that they can then do further DNA work in. So it's very technical, but like Shufeldt, there's an emotional part of that very clear science. So just to conclude and thinking about emotion and extinction here, that in environmental history, emotions are not irrational. So we have the legacy of thinking of somehow that rationality doesn't have emotional basis. But in fact, it may be completely rational to have the emotional reaction that you're having. So it makes sense, in other words, that you might grieve something that's gone, or you might hope that your work will make a difference and make a better world, or that you're angry that something happens. That those are actually rational responses to an event. That there can be a wide range of emotions and responses, even within the same person, or and the same situation. So passenger pigeon extinction, it isn't just that we have grief or melancholy. It's actually a wide range of things. And that Things like science and technological development, scientific work in the area of conservation, for example, happen with emotions. They have an emotional basis. Why people are involved in them, why they're doing them at all, is often deeply rooted in emotions. That people have emotional attachments to things, both real objects that exist, but also the ideas of those objects. And we see that in the case of like Novak talking about the passenger pigeon, which has never been alive, either in his lifetime, his parents' lifetime, and maybe even his grandparents' lifetime. It hasn't been there, but there's this idea of passenger pigeon, and you can have an emotional attachment to that as well. And so I think these are things for historians in general, but environmental historians specifically, to consider when we're looking at the past and why people have done the conservation or environmentalist actions they have, that emotions are an integral part, if not in many cases, the foundational part of why they're doing what they're doing. So Shufeldt couldn't dissect the heart, but as historians, our call is to do exactly that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dolly. That was a wonderful talk. I guess we'll handle the questions by having people please use the chat, and then I'll read them out to Dolly. Maybe while people are coming up with questions, I'll ask when to get the ball rolling. You talked about Hornaday and his emotions, his rage and grief and shaming. When I think about Hornaday and his use of emotions in his writing, it always seems very bound up with his perceptions of masculinity and appropriate gender conduct. So he's outraged by hunters killing the mothers of a herd of deer or mother birds, and sees this as disgraceful behavior for a man. I just wonder how much of that you encounter in this research, kind of this intersection of gender and emotion in the unfolding of environmental history, maybe specifically pertaining to extinction and rewilding.
Yeah, very interesting question. Because, in my work here on extinction, almost everybody is male who's writing about these things. And yes, you're right. There are cases in which he specifically is talking about hunters as not doing the right thing by civilized man, and he does mean it in a masculine sense in that case. There's actually some nice analysis. Hannah Rose Shell, for example, has a nice analysis of his buffalo herd setup. So what he does with these buffalo or bison that he kills is they make an exhibit of them where it's the father and the mother and the calf, right? So you're getting this kind of family idea, and it's somehow representative of a correct American family, and how it should, operate in its in its setup. Interestingly, I don't know of anything he writes or that anyone writes about Martha as a female bird.
Oh, that's interesting.
Some people, they talk about her. Well, there is some writing about her being lonely after her mate, because they had a male in the cage with her. They never successfully laid eggs. So there are some descriptions of her as being, lonely after her mate dies. So that kind of grieving widow kind of shows up. But it doesn't really carry forward very far. It's a more contemporaneous with her in the newspaper coverage. So I know some people who are working on kind of thinking through the sexuality of the extinction in particular, so this resurrecting of species, and the ways in which this requires that you think about breeding, right? So you need to reproduce, you're trying to reproduce something. And so issues of males and females, and how do those work, particularly when it's talking about genetic changes. So there is some work being done on that, and the ways in which it's a reproductive project. So when you produce an animal, you're reproducing it. So I think we'll be seeing more of that kind of work, because it's kind of new in thinking through the gender dimensions.
Okay, thank you. We have lots of good questions coming in.
Good.
The first is from Kanksha Chawla, and she thanks you so much for your presentation and would like to know if during your research you came across or tracked emotional responses for a particular person as a function of time. For example, a shift in emotion from shaming and sorrow and rage to perhaps something else. So kind of diachronic emotional history.
Great question. I actually did not do that directly with anybody where I saw that kind of change. I tended to focus more on because particular stories or particular instances of this restoration or rewilding, I found tended to have a primary emotion that tended to show up frequently. And so I tended to focus on those, like what were these primary framings, so that when I told my story about beavers that are brought back to Sweden from Norway, I looked at guilt as an emotion in that chapter. So, I mean, one certainly could do that to see if a particular individual changes their tune over time. But I can't think of any examples offhand in which I'd really see that clearly, that somebody started out with one and then later shifts with another, or even that the story goes through definitive shifts. I mean, I think there are some with the passenger pigeon, in that you move from the story of, or a primary emotion about grief, and go through this kind of anger phase, but grief is still there, to this moment now, which is about hope. So once you get to the centenary celebration of Martha, the sorrow, which you see in some of the texts about Martha, becomes very quickly moved over to a hopeful story. Either it's hope because we're going to remake it as a species, or hope that we're going to not do the same thing to other species that we did to the passenger pigeon. So that would be a case where I think there's a shift of the primary emotion that's involved in the discourse.
It kind of sounded like the stages of grief, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's in the
denial.
passenger pigeon chapter. That's what I use, because I saw that. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, I started with the stages of grief and then I like applied it. It was the other way around. It's that when I started describing it, I realized, wait a second, that sounds an awful lot like the idea of the stages of grief. So I, then read up on that. And that exactly. So I think there is some of that in there. That one has a shift.
Thank you. Another question for you from Glenn Toe. Everybody thanks you for the talk. First of all, so Glenn is in language and applied linguistics, and he says, when we write in journals about language loss or language rights or language teaching, reviewers tell us to be objective, detached, and unemotional. Do you know of any work on emotions in relation to language rights? And then do you have a published paper on what you have presented? I guess your book would be the best place to go for that. And thirdly, when journal reviewers call for objectivity and detachment, is this an act of oppression and silencing of emotional voices?
Yeah, really, really good, because we're thinking about here then our own practice as academics. So thank you for the question. Yeah, so as far as what I talked about today, much of that is in my book. I've supplemented it now with some more information, particularly the stuff on Hornaday, because I've added, I have an article that'll be coming out. That's an overview article I'm writing with Andy Flack on emotions and environmental history for a handbook of history of emotions. So it's on, how we're doing it in environmental history. So that is forthcoming, I think, next year as their date for publication for that. But so my book and that one would be where I'd say. But yeah, our own practice as academics. Yes, it's interesting, particularly those of us that are dealing with things like extinction of languages, extinction of indigenous peoples, extinction of animals, how to talk about and present those in our work. I do think it is unfortunate if journal editors are not willing to accept that this is a situation we should be upset about, or we should have emotional responses to the situation. I guess what I would say is you may be able to pick words that display your emotions without seeming emotional. In that, yeah, the way one writes it. But that is certainly, yeah, it's a very fine line to walk, I guess, as an academic. Being the co-editor of Environmental Humanities, I think we in general, a lot of our pieces, we actually have a category called provocation. So we don't mind it being somewhat, if you will, in your face about, with its language. So that is one way that a journal can have a space, but I'm not saying we would publish something that sounded too angry either. So if somebody was like yelling the whole time, right? It's kind of like that writing a tweet in all caps, where you're like, oh my God, what's wrong with you? If somebody writes like that, I also probably wouldn't publish it either. So there is something about, I would not say being objective and distant from your object of study, because what I've seen in Extinction is that even natural scientists are not objective and distant from their objects of study, even if they pretend somehow to be. But it is about being a certain kind of measured in the language that you use to describe what's going on. And being careful, I think the other thing as a journal editor, being careful about who you talk about as the source of the problem, and where your evidence lies for that. So making sure that is clear is also, I think, often a thing that we look for, right? You can't just be mad at the world to be mad at the world, but you need to have specific things that you say that it's unjust. In other words, I guess as an editor, I would have no problem with somebody saying something was unjust if they've proved to me that it's unjust. I might have a problem if they wrote it was a disgrace. You know, so you might think about which words, I guess, you're using to describe something. But this is it's a real issue, and how we, particularly in this environmental, well, and political moment, right? We also have a lot of politics going on that are very unjust, and we do have a responsibility as academics to make that known to publics, and that we find it unacceptable. So yeah, so I think using words like, well, something's unacceptable, and telling me why it's unacceptable, I would find a reasonable thing to publish.
Okay, thank you very much. The questions are just coming in fast and furious. You probably knew you'd be getting a Jurassic Park question. Yuan Chong says that when they think of bringing back extinct animals, it's hard not to think about Jurassic Park. What are the potential social, it's an enormous question, but maybe briefly, what are the potential social and political consequences of bringing back extinct animals, in your opinion?
Yeah. So yes, this is something that one expects. You're always going to get the Jurassic Park. And the thing is, it's not that crazy to think about bringing back extinct animals. It just won't be dinosaurs. I mean, that's relatively undoable. I mean, there's been some insects that we've recovered some blood materials from them, but that's not enough to reconstruct the genome. Okay, so when you think about remaking an extinct species, you need to have DNA material that tells you what it looks like. So you need to be able to reconstruct what their genome was. This has actually been a problem even with something that died as recently as the 1920s. So the Tasmanian thylacine, so the Tasmanian tiger, which kind of looks like a thin, kind of thinnish dog shape. I mean, kind of like a canine, in that it's not a canine, but it's in that kind of look. And it was the largest marsupial carnivore, and it became extinct in the 1920s or 1930s, I guess, the last one that dies. They tried to do a genetic project to find out, to be able to remake it, but they're having a hard time even getting the DNA sequence, because all the existing specimens, so when something would die and you taxidermy it, you treat it with chemicals to keep the body from breaking down. That's how you see stuff in museums, right? Otherwise it would decompose. It would just, you know, microbes would come into it and it would just turn into dust. So they preserve it. So you either preserve it as a whole, like with skins or bones, or you preserve it in fluid, the ones that are in jars. But in all those cases, you've treated the material, and that breaks down the DNA. So there's been a big ongoing project since the late 1990s to try and recover enough DNA to be able to DNA sequence the thylacine. They're still not there yet, but you have to have that first. So when you have that, if you will, that makes the map. This is what their DNA looks like. Then you can take something that currently exists and you can modify the DNA to look like this. So you pick something that's close, but not exactly, and then you change it. The most reasonable, well, the one that's had a lot of work done on it is the mammoths, because they're being exposed at incredible rates up in Siberia because of climate change. So we've got all these nicely preserved, not preserved in a museum, but nicely preserved from under the ground, whole body specimens. So they have great DNA map now. Their problem with remaking the mammoth is that they would need to use elephants, but elephants are protected by the CITES treaties because they're endangered. So they don't have any species to use as their surrogates. So something has to, if you will, have the babies, right? We actually don't have technology yet, artificial womb technology, where we'd make a baby in a, if you think sci-fi, right, in a big glass womb, and then it would be born. We can't do that, not yet. So we need a host mother. Well, they can't use elephants because of restrictions on elephants. So they're kind of stuck at the moment. Otherwise, and maybe somebody will do it unethically, won't surprise me. But I've always thought mammoths would be kind of first out because they have the best data. And the Chinese and Russian scientists are very interested in doing it, remaking the mammoth steppes. So, if you will, releasing them into the northern part of Russia to remake the big plains there with mammoths. It's of course problematic with climate change. Like, it'll be too hot for mammoths pretty soon. So, are we just making them to die? This has been one of the questions about things like the passenger pigeon. Well, if you remake the passenger pigeon, where exactly are the passenger pigeons supposed to go, right? I mean, people live there in the whole part of North America where they used to be, and it's mostly corn farms now. So would we be somehow making them and they would have no habitats to inhabit? So most of many of the critiques have had to do with that. There's also been critiques about, if you think of North America and you're going to rewild it, you're going to bring lions. So this is one of the things people talk about. So bring lions to the plains because there were lions in the North American plains and, at the end of the last ice age. But, what kind of social, economic consequences would that have, right? As far as conflict. So in my book, in my chapter on rewilding, I look at muskox, which were brought back to Norway. And when they were brought in the 1930s, I mean, nobody had the word rewilding. That comes much later. But now we would consider it such a project. But what happens is that people come in conflict with these animals. I mean, people have farms and sheep and their dogs, and the native Sami herders have reindeer, and now these muskox are there. So it's not easy. And so there's a lot of people who object. So they're still in Norway and some in Sweden, and there are people who object to them existing there because of their own social economic reasons.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from Grace. I think it's an excellent question. She says, since you talked about the intersection between writing, emotions, and conservation, I was wondering how poetry is important to the conservation extinction discourse, since poetry is a form of writing that is usually highly emotionally charged.
Great question. And yes, so poetry and art in general, so thinking about also creative arts, is one of the places that you really see that particular emotional words are picked up and used. So I have an article, it's not in my book, but an article that looks at the word endling, which means, or which comes to mean, the last individual of a species. So Martha would be an endling. And I look at the way in which this word was invented and put to use, first at the National Museum of Australia in their display of thylacines. And then what I do is I look at the way in which that word then was picked up in the creative arts. So how a choreographer used that word endling because, and I interviewed him, and you know, because of it, he said it had a particular power. It was a sorrowful word, but had it evoked emotion. There was also a composer who wrote a symphony called endling for the same reason. He talked about it as, you know, it was both a mysterious word and one that made you think, and made you think you knew what it meant, but then you didn't. And I mean, the orchestral piece that he wrote, I mean, it's very emotive. It's about sorrow and loss at a deep kind of level. And he was inspired, it's called endling, and it was inspired through this word that's used in the museum, which he had, you know, seen. So, and the same goes then, I mean, there's a short story that I talk about that's written about, that's called The Endling, where it's the last of a robot species, you know, short science fiction story. So it gets picked up in all these kind of creative arts, so not just poetry, but other arts as well, because it's an emotional word, because they feel it can evoke a sense of something that they want to do with their art. So I think you're exactly right. So poetry has an emotional register in it, and so therefore is really good for actually communicating and analyzing its emotions. And in Extinction in particular, you see that. I'm thinking here about Merwin's. He has a poem about extinction, which is actually I love. It's really good, for a coming extinction, and it has this emotional register. So I'll just read you this poem by W.S. Merwin. Gray whale, now that we are sending you to the end, the great God, tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing. I write as though you could understand, and I could say it. One must always pretend something among the dying. When you've left the seas nodding on their stalks, empty of you, tell him that we were made on another day. The bewilderment will diminish like an echo, winding along your inner mountains unheard by us, and find its way out, leaving behind it the future, dead, and ours. When you will not see again the whale calves trying the light, consider what you will find in the black garden and its court. The sea cows, the great ox, the gorillas, the irreplaceable hosts ranged countless, and foreordaining as stars our sacrifices. Join your word to theirs. Tell him that it's we who are important. So this is Merwin's For a Coming Extinction. And I think it has this register about how we talk about ourselves, right, is what it's getting at. How we talk about ourselves versus animals, and what decisions we make in that. And you see, yeah, that extinction then can become this, it's a very emotive action, and can have some nice analysis with that.
Thank you. The next question is from Mike Rayner. And the question is, I was wondering if there are any records of the emotional responses to extinction from indigenous communities, and whether these differ from Western responses.
Yes, so with the passenger pigeon, there are a few writings that were collected in a book of kind of writings about passenger pigeons that was close to the extinction time. That includes some writings by a Native American indigenous person. So one was a chief of a tribe who, yeah, I will say he's very angry. That's how I would characterize that particular writing. You know, angry at the at the white man in this case, and their rapacious greed. So many people writing immediately after the passenger pigeon would talk about greed as a big factor, right? It's about commercial exploitation of passenger pigeons that brought about their end. So he is an indigenous writer who's making that comment or that particular article. So that is an example. I know of a couple people who have analyzed or talked about responses. So there's a nice article about a researcher taking museum specimens to an indigenous community, and then the indigenous community, as part of this project, to, if you will, get their reactions and their stories with the samples, because these are things that are gone from that local area or gone completely, but it can also be that they're just locally extinct. And what you see there, the description, so this isn't written by the indigenous person, but the description is of the response and what this woman said in responding emotionally to this, I think it was a wallaby, maybe a rock wallaby of some kind, about how, oh, you know, it's so good to see you again here on my land. You know, you're home again, kind of this kind of emotive language, and the description is very yeah, I get a bit teary-eyed in a way of this connection to land coming from an Australian Aboriginal, particularly because of the idea of country, right, and what belongs in country and what's missing. So so I think there's some work like that. Those are the ones that I know of offhand. But there hasn't really, I have not seen analysis of those, you know, the indigenous response to extinction. I actually haven't seen anybody specifically writing about that.
Great. Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. And there are actually quite a few questions. Is it okay if people email you with questions about this talk?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So sorry if I don't get to your question, but please email Dolly to follow up. Okay. The final talk is from Stefan Hubner, and he says this is a slightly eccentric question. Did you ever, or do you plan to compare the emotions that the actors you talked about felt, for example, related to the passenger pigeons, to the emotions that cryptozoologists felt about not finding the animals that they thought they were looking for? In a sense, emotions about extinction and killing versus emotions about disappearing, or more realistically, the animals that never existed, the animals never having existed.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, actually. I think it would make for a nice piece to look at cryptozoologists and their disappointment, right? So disappointment as an emotional reaction. So I think you should write it, would be my response. that, because I would read it. I'd be happy to read it. If not a direct comparison, but actually looking at their disappointment. Because see, I think that's the big message I would have, is that there's a lot of different emotions. We experience a lot of, there's a whole range of things. And even right now, even within history of emotions, you're kind of just touching the surface of some big ones, right? So it's kind of the anger and fear. I mean, it's relatively easy to see those, or happiness, I guess. But something like disappointment, I would find it absolutely fascinating to think about the ways in which they express that disappointment. So please write it.
He says,
put it on
thanks for putting it on my
to-do list
to-do
with everything else. Stefan.
Is it all right if I post your work email address to this chat?
Yeah, that's fine. So everybody can feel free to let me know if you have any specific questions. So yeah, I think just to kind of close off with some things, is that there's a lot of room. I think there's a whole lot that needs to be done in this area, not just of course with extinction, but with all environmental issues, in really taking seriously the emotional states and emotional motivations and the ways in which emotion are used in discourse, and being explicit about that. So how we use anger and shame and guilt and grief, and how it motivates us. And this is a really big issue that I think environmental historians, and then other humanities people dealing with environments as well, need to incorporate more directly into their work.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, and thank you to everybody who attended.
Thanks, everyone. Have yourself a good evening there in Singapore and roundabout. And for those of you if anybody's in Europe, have yourself a good day.